three issues tonight. But before talking about the main event, the three issues, it occurs to me it's been a while since we really have addressed what should be the end to the Ukraine-Russian war. And in the past, I've expressed frustration, I still have this frustration, as to why is not the Biden administration trying to work towards an end to the war? Eventually, every war ends. The longer the war drags on, the worse it is for all involved. Ukraine has the second lowest birth rate in the world. It is a tragedy for any country to lose its young people, but particularly for a country that has so few young people in the first place. Likewise, Russia has a low birth rate, and they also have a high immigration rate in which people are coming to this country. I ran into one in my district. I know from spending time in the San Diego sector along the Mexican border, a lot of Russians have come across there. So you have two countries with a shortage of young people, and they are dying in a war. For humanitarian reasons, we ought to end that war on its own. Furthermore, the war is very costly. Buildings being damaged in Ukraine to a huge extent. And geopolitically, the Biden policy of letting this war drag on without sticking their nose in it at all for well over a year now drives China and Russia together. It wasn't that long ago that we had over 1,000 McDonald's in Russia. I recently toured a factory in my district. They owned a similar factory in Russia, which they had to sell off. But what I took out of it is there was a time in the relatively recent past when the United States and Russia had very good relations. The United States and Ukraine had very good relations. And I don't know why we couldn't get back there if this war ended quickly. But it seems when you talk to the Biden people, they don't care if it goes on for years. So I make a plea to the Biden administration. See if you can look into doing what you can do to end that war. Now, we'll look at three issues that I think all have the potential to destroy the country, and I think we need some clear thinking on all three. The first of all, let's look at the border. There has been a change in the way some people are entering the country. They're able to sign on to get entry to the United States on an app, apparently, if they're coming in from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. But because more people are coming in that way, it kind of makes it more difficult to see how many people are coming in each month. And therefore, we begin, because it's now in two different places, we begin to lose track of the number of people coming into this country compared to where we were historically. Okay? So let's look at, for example, where we were in May. In the most recent May, 227,000 people came across the border, what we refer to as illegally. A year ago, it was 166,000. 2 years ago, it was 74,000. And 3 years ago, under President Trump, it was 6,000. So we've gone from 6,000 a month crossing in May to 227,000 crossing in May. Kind of a dramatic increase and something that should remain on the front page of our newspapers every day until this crisis abates. Same thing if you look at April, now that we get the other numbers. In April, most recently, 211,000 people crossing the border. A year ago, 187. 2 years ago, 66,000. And 3 years ago, under 6,000. So again, we've gone from under 6,000 to 211,000. Dramatic increase in the number of people crossing the border. And this is not a problem we can't deal with because we got to be more bipartisan. It's always nice to be bipartisan, but this problem was solved 3 years ago, and now we've gone up by a factor of over 30. As we have an increasing number of people crossing the border, we also have more unaccompanied minors crossing the border. And people ought to be especially concerned when people who are 13 or 14 years old are crossing the border without parents or even, say, an aunt or an uncle. Now we're having about 6,000 to 8,000 unaccompanied minors crossing every month. Under the prior administration, 500 to 1,000. So a lot more young people. And there was a time when people on the other side of the aisle would be concerned about people crossing the border and separately from their families. That was people who were separated for maybe 2 weeks, well, because their parents had broken the law. Now we have 6,000 to 8,000 people every month being separated from their parents, and who knows if they'll ever see them again. For minors, the lack of concern is stunning. Recently, an article in the New York Times, which I think the administration is to a degree disavowed, but no matter whose numbers you look at, the administration has lost track of tens of thousands of minors. They don't know where they are after they gave them to people to take care of them. We've lost track of tens of thousands of kids. Particularly, we have a crisis in this country of human trafficking, sex trafficking. That should be of particular concern to the administration, and it should be a particular concern because people rarely come over here without the Mexican drug cartel signing off. We can only imagine that when these young kids work, sometimes third shifts in factories illegally, that they are sending money not only back home, but to the drug cartels as well. I talked to the labor secretary as what she should do, the acting labor secretary, what she should do if minors are found crossing illegally or if minors are found working illegally. She refused to say how often they contact the parents, which again I thought was horrible. If you were an inspector of a factory and found 15-year-old immigrants working there who shouldn't, isn't the first thing you do contact the parents? Obviously, the Biden administration doesn't do that. The Secretary of Labor will not be drawn into even commenting that we've ever found or that we ever contact the parents of young people who are found here. We should always try to unite children with their parents. Quite frankly, I even feel at the border, if children come across with one parent, we should hold them up and look for the other parent. In the United States, if parents are dealing with a divorce situation, they sometimes try, in an effort to keep that family together, they sometimes try and say one parent cannot move to another part of the country because we want both parents to participate in raising the children. I don't know why we don't do the same thing at our southern border. On the flip side of letting everyone in, we are also taking our eye off of criminals who are not kicked out. Without a lot of hoopla in the newspapers, the Biden administration, in their budget, guesses that for the next 2 years, we can anticipate about 29,000 people being deported. And I think they might have computed it in a different way, but in his final 2 years under Barack Obama, we deported about 460,000 people. So in one 2-year period under Obama, 460,000 deported. Under Joe Biden, President Biden, we have only 29,000 deported in a 2-year period. It's just like saying we absolutely don't care what's going on here. And of course, many deportations are caused by people here who are breaking the law. I mean, people who are for open borders at least say, oh, they're all so wonderful people. They're so hardworking. What an asset to America. The Biden administration is doing a pretty pathetic job, even compared to his predecessors, including President Obama. He's doing a bad job of deporting people who break the law. Of course, along with being soft on the border and letting everybody across, it inevitably means more people bringing drugs across the border. In this country right now, we have about 108,000 people every year dying of illegal drug overdoses. That's a crisis that America is not paying careful enough attention to. As I pointed out before, we have about 57,000 Americans died in the Vietnam War over 12 years. I'm old enough to remember the Vietnam War. There were articles all the time about American troops dying. People were protesting about how many Americans were dying, and 57,000 people died in 12 years. A true tragedy. We now have 108,000 Americans dying every year from illegal drug overdoses in this country, largely because illegal drugs are flying across the southern border. Virtually nothing is being done in this budget to tighten up the border. Nothing is being done to prevent more people from coming here. The inevitable result is a further change of America as people come here who may not have the traditional American values that we need to keep our Republican going, not to mention we will have people coming here who are taking advantage of our generous welfare system and people coming who are breaking the law and are not going to be deported. So that is the first issue that I feel that we really have to address. The second horrible policy concerns the bizarre demands of this new transgender lobby. This past week, I had quite an experience, and I met with an 18-year-old who had doctors prescribed from 12 years old on testosterone and puberty blockers. At age 15, the wonderful medical establishment in our United States of America, I think primarily from the psychiatry wing of the medical establishment, decided to remove her breasts at age 15. I don't care if you went to medical school. Anybody with an ounce of common sense knows people change dramatically between when they're 15 and 20 and 30 and 40. The idea that we have people going to medical school, I guess that's why they talk about people with book smarts and common sense. Nobody with common sense, unless they are absolutely obsessed with greed and just will do anything to make money on a surgery, would possibly remove the breasts of a 15-year-old girl. They're doing it at 2 hospitals in Wisconsin, which is horrible. This gal happened to have it done in California. Now this poor woman wants to undo the damage, and she can't. In Europe, they're finding that puberty blockers may affect bones and brain growth, brain health. Sweden found that 10 years after reassignment surgery, the suicide rate was 20 times that of their peers. Is that even really a surprise? I could almost guess it on my own without reading the study. But that's what they're finding in Europe, who went down this path before this. Now in European countries, even their liberal, let's worship the doctor societies knows that they made a mistake. I think someone has to look at the psychiatric industry and give them some more supervision, because they're doing horrible things that anybody with any common sense would know. The other thing the Europeans found is something we should realize in this country too. This is a much bigger problem than when I was a child and nobody ever seemed to know about it. How is that possible? Well, it's possible because the more they talk about it in the press, the more they talk about it in the entertainment medium, the more self-righteous politicians talk about it, the more young people begin to play in their mind with the idea that maybe if they're a boy, they should be a girl, and maybe if they're girls, should be a boy. This is what happened to the poor gal I met with. She was, 10 or 11 years old, 12 years old. She was unhappy. And given all that's out there on the internet, she thought, well, maybe I'm unhappy because I should be a boy, which is perfectly understandable if you're inundated with this option on television, on the computer constantly. So this is what we have. We have a gender dysphoria crisis, and the crisis has been caused by all these doctors claiming it is a common thing. And the more kids hear about other people going through it, they may read articles about it, as this gal did, read about it on the internet. Oh, sounds interesting. There are these experts saying I'm unhappy because maybe I want to be a boy. And that's what happens. So I hope the press is a little bit more responsible in the future about pushing this as an everyday thing, because when the press begins to push it, when it gets out there on the computer screen, people begin to read it and people begin to say, oh, maybe it's me. There are at least 2 congressmen out there with great bills on this, one from Georgia, one from California. I hope we see these bills on the floor of the Congress here in the very near future. My one criticism of the bills is they only ban this type of horrific surgery under age 18. I don't know why we don't try to knock that up a little bit higher. I know in this country, as a practical matter, we barred the sale of beer until age 21. I think this surgery seems a little bit crazy even for a 30-year-old, but I hope we see these bills on the floor soon, and I hope before they get to the floor, the authors make an adjustment to the bills and knock up the age to at least age 21. One other comment I learned reading about this situation and talking to someone who went through it, part of the problem is we have these well-meaning progressive people who egg these people on. You know, they get on, their Facebook page or whatever, they tell them, people who they don't even know, they tell them how proud they are for doing these surgeries, how happy they should be if now that you did these surgeries. And by the popular culture acting as cheerleaders for these surgeries, what do you think you get? A bunch of young, unhappy people who want to be happier? Well, every time someone sends you an email, sends you whatever, comments, you're so brave, I'm so happy for you, you are encouraging these people to get these horrific surgeries. So a lot of the blame, I think, goes on the people who are not familiar with this, not familiar with this study showing a dramatic increase in suicides, not to mention people without any common sense, and they egg these poor boys and girls on to get these surgeries. And I beg people who consider, encouraging these people or flattering these people for what they're doing, please stop it, familiarize yourself with the information, and stop and think that by flattering and encouraging these people, you may be the one responsible for making these life-changing decisions. And I'll wind up by saying, I think we need more people looking at the qualifications of some of these psychiatrists who push this. I mean, why this whole profession has allowed this to careen out of control. I think we have to look at the role that profession is playing in our society. And the reason I'll blame President Biden a little for this is his administration is all in on this transgender sexual confusion agenda, which is leading so many people to be unhappy. Now, the fourth area that I'd like to address tonight, and I don't like to address it. I really don't like to address it because it's such an awkward area. But it's got to be addressed because the President of the United States is obsessed with it. So we've got to address it. The final issue is the issue of racism. It's Joe Biden's favorite issue as far as I can tell. Joe Biden talked about racism 4 times in his inaugural speech and white supremacy once. He keeps bringing it up in his State of the Union speeches. Again this year, he inferred that policemen are racist, and we have to warn little, particularly black children, about racist police. The studies don't show it. The studies show adjusted for crimes committed, if anything. It's the other way around, but Joe Biden, a white guy, I wonder what other people think of him, keeps getting up there and saying how racist we all are here. And that we have a racist problem with police. And like I said, the studies show that that's not true. What you can do, and I think people like Joe Biden have done, is you can intimidate the police in being afraid to act because they're a fear of being charged with racism. That you can do. And you can make the police timid. And of course, ever since we had this massive anti-police feeling in the aftermath of the events in Minneapolis a couple of years ago, we've had a dramatic increase in the number of murders, and I think a lot of these murders have to be blamed on the timidity of the police, which is caused by this strong anti-police feeling that you're getting out of Joe Biden and his allies, and the mainstream media, which I think also creates this anti-police feeling and causes the police to feel that they have to back off for fear they'll be called racist or whatever. Joe Biden, again, talked about white supremacy at Howard University at their graduation. Kind of a weird speech, because I think normally in graduation speeches, you're dealing with the best and brightest in America. I know Howard has a very good reputation. You should have people who should just be leaving that stage with smiles on their face, anxious to change the world, who do wonderful things in the United States. Instead, we get President Biden showing up and saying what a racist society we have, and creating, I think, a defeatist attitude for the people graduating there. I hope they got over Joe Biden's speech. Joe Biden's labor secretary, designated, she hasn't been confirmed yet, believes the country was built on white supremacy. She will not back off on that statement, despite me asking her a couple times to do so. So the labor secretary, who has something to do about all sorts of laws in this country, apparently believes our country was built on white supremacy. The proposed chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff feels we should be capping the number of white officers in the military at 42%. I mean, I would think you'd be primarily concerned about getting the best people in there. It's important we have the best military of the world. Instead, we're going to have a bean counter who it sounds like is more concerned about where people's great-great-great-grandparents were born than what their qualifications are today. A study found, as we mentioned before, in Joe Biden's first 2 years, of 97 judges he appointed, only 5 were white men, 2 of those were gay. And this was in the aftermath of 2 Democrat senators telling President Biden they were not going to confirm any more of his appointees if they were white men unless they were gay. So, to what degree are our judges, again, being picked as the best, or what degree are they being picked with Joe Biden feeling there's something wrong with appointing a white guy for the job? And those are kind of amazing numbers, aren't they? I mean, I, who am not a big fan of President Biden, would have guessed, if you would have asked me how many white men were in his first 97 judges, I would say, well, he's probably doing all he can to find people who aren't white guys. It's only 25 or 30. Well, it's only 5. In his budget, he is asking in all of his agencies, Department of Defense, Department of Interior, wherever, new equity action teams. These pernicious new employees, I think, are going to run around and judge people solely by race or gender. Their goal, supposedly they're looking at diversity, which we'll talk about in a second. But again, their goal is following down this path of all Americans are supposed to view themselves as a subgroup. He tried to discharge debt of farmers only of color until the court shot him down there. He's trying to add a new preferred class, and all these topics are recent topics. So, we ought to discuss this issue before it goes any further. Right now, there are a variety of classes when you fill out your census form, when you fill out your EEO-1, which is a form that you've got to fill out if you do business with the government. They break you out if you're Asian, Pacific Islander, African American, Latin American, Native American. They want a new class, and I think with a class comes preferences for Middle Eastern and North African people. Again, I think we should have a public discussion here. I don't think Middle Eastern and North African people have been discriminated or mistreated in America. I assume most of the people, if there are benefits from this program, will come about to people who just came here or are coming in the future. I haven't seen a lot of articles on that, but there should be a public discussion. If somebody comes here from Syria, if somebody comes here from Algeria, should they get preferences in hiring? Should they get preferences if they found a business and are looking for a government contract? Should they get preferences if they want to get into medical school? That's what President Biden apparently wants, but I think we should have a public discussion whether he gets away with it. As an aside, I'm not sure how the I'm not sure how Joe Biden feels the country is such a white supremacist country. I don't believe you can really judge people, their worth, their happiness by the amount of income, but it's a number that's easy to judge. And if you look online, most of the successful groups in America today are not of European heritage. You know, the most successful is from India. Most Indians that I know came here and are wildly successful, though they came here without even knowing English. People from Pakistan, Philippines, Taiwan, Cuba. Thomas Sowell wrote a book 40 years ago, so it's a bit out of date, but I can't find any more recent information, in which he claims that people coming from the Caribbean, the children of people who come here from the Caribbean make more money than the average American. So I guess he'd be talking about people from Jamaica, and I suppose you can think of people therefore like Kamala Harris's dad, who came here from Jamaica, wound up being a professor at Stanford, did very well. I don't think he had a huge amount of experience with racism becoming a professor at Stanford. I would think most professors would love to have a job like that. But before we go that much further, I do think we should look at individual questions that should be answered. First question is, right now, for the purpose of these government forms and who you hire, you kind of self-identify. And therefore, if you are, say, we'll pick Peru, because I talked to someone in Peru the other day, if you came here directly from Peru, you're Peruvian, you're Latin American. But if you have one of 4 grandchildren, you're also called Peruvian and are considered to bring a diverse attitude towards your job, or America supposedly should make up for past discrimination, even though your ancestors may never even have been in America. So is it 25%? Is it 12.5%? The senator from Massachusetts, she had one of these DNA tests, and she found out she was like 164th Native American, or less than 164th. But she apparently felt it was enough to put on her forms, and apparently add diversity to the Harvard Law School faculty. I don't know if she really thought that, but I guess she allowed herself to be labeled as Native American based on whatever that would be, one great-great-great-great-grandparent. But is that the way we should go? Or should it be 1 out of 8? Like if one of your 8 great-grandparents is a certain type, is that enough to identify that type? Now we have DNA tests, so we can look at these things. I know in my district there was a rumor that one person who owned a construction company, they questioned whether he was really a person of color like he claimed he was. Again, how much he could have been, because he could say I'm 1/8, and under the current law that would be enough to get preferences. But I think we ought to have that discussion. The next question is, since when affirmative action really began in the 1960s, the idea was to make up, I think, for America's past sins. So should you have to have ancestors in America who can at least claim to have been hurt? Or can you get what amounts to special preferences if you just immigrated to this country, say, a year ago? I mean, right now you don't have to be a citizen. You can count on the government forms, in which I think they view you more favorably. If you have people from certain backgrounds, if you even came here and were never in America for more than a couple years before you got here. So should we require beneficiaries of these programs to be in America? Were your ancestors slaves, or can you in America, or can you be like Kamala Harris's dad and just have moved here from Jamaica? Whether he got preferences or not, I don't know. Next issue that we should talk about is, how long should this happen? We began to have and affirmative action in the early 1960s. I think it really kicked into effect in 1965 under Lyndon Johnson. There was a lesser program under John Kennedy. Okay, so we've had this program going for about 50 years. Obviously, they've added new groups that weren't included in the original number of groups. We have women in the mix now, too. How long should this program last? With its government bureaucracy, with, in essence, government looking over people's shoulder, telling them who you have to hire for your company, that sort of thing. Another 10 years, another 100 years. Thomas Sowell has written about affirmative action, and so that's another issue that we will have to look at. We'll return and talk about other issues later after this evening, not the least of which I think we should talk about how certain people think, since you're supposed to be bringing diversity to the table. But I will yield the remainder of my time, and I move adjournment too.
Does the gentleman have a motion?
I make the motion to adjourn. Time to go home.
The question is on the motion to